Welcome to the Art of Actual Change. I'm your host, Derek Nielsen, former health specialist turned wildlife conservation fine art photographer. Through my travels around the world, I've met some fascinating people doing amazing work to make this planet a better place to live. Each week, I'll be bringing you these people, letting them tell their stories, and hopefully you'll gather information on how you can make a difference and learn the art of actually making a change. Welcome back, everyone, to the Art of Actual Change. I have a great guest today. Her name is Jettie Word. She is the executive director of the Borneo Project. This is an organization in Borneo, Malaysia, Indonesia, right? Both of those countries are you reaching into?
In Malaysia.
Malaysia. Yeah. Okay. Well, Borneo is made up of 3 countries, and she can kind of talk more about what the Borneo Project is all about. But the Borneo Project is protecting human rights and environmental integrity in Borneo. And I will let Jettie talk more about what the Borneo Project is. So welcome to the podcast, Jettie. Thank you so much for taking the time. And I hope I'm pronouncing your name correct.
Yep, you got it right.
All right, yeah. Excellent. So what is the Borneo Project? What are you working on and how are you founded?
Sure. So the Borneo Project supports Indigenous-led land rights campaigns in Malaysian Borneo. And Malaysian Borneo is basically the top third of the island of Borneo. The island of Borneo itself is really big. It's about the size of Texas, or it's bigger than Texas, bigger than France. Wow. It's the 3rd largest island in the world. And the bottom 2/3 belong to Indonesia. And then there's 2 Malaysian states in the north, Sarawak and Sabah. And we work in the Malaysian state of Sarawak. And there's another country, there's the tiny little country of Brunei that's kind of nestled in between Sabah and Sarawak.
Okay, great.
Yeah.
So what is the work that your foundation is doing in Sarawak particularly?
In Sarawak, we support Indigenous-led land rights campaigns. So that's meant a lot of different things throughout the years. We've been working there for about 30 years now. And so we have done things like mapping with communities who are trying to get legal title for their land. We've done reforestation projects, community gardens, fighting megadams, fighting logging, fighting oil palm expansion. We're always following what the people on the ground need in the moment and following their priorities. So what we're doing at any given moment is dependent on their needs.
Wow, so you're primarily based on the indigenous populations? Is that what you spend your time focused on?
Yeah, that's right.
What type of uphill battles are they facing as a people?
Well, there's a lot going on. It's,
Sure.
Land grabbing is happening and has been happening all over the world with indigenous populations. In Sarawak in particular, where we work, the main issue is logging, so extraction of timber, and there's also oil palm expansion happening. Although the current places where we're working, logging is more of an issue than oil palm expansion at the moment, because these places are pretty remote and quite mountainous. So most of the oil palm expansion has mostly been on flatter land at lower altitudes. Okay. However, there are indications that companies are looking to move into these mountainous areas as well.
Are there certain big players that are pushing the logging deeper in, or is it kind of a logging poaching style thing where it's one-off people doing it, or maybe it's both?
The main issue is legal logging from large corporations. So logging has actually slowed in Sarawak in the last couple of years, which is great, but it's partly because they're running out of space to log. So there's been a massive extraction of timber in Sarawak. I think during the early 2000s, there was more timber extracted from Sarawak, so just one Malaysian state on the island of Borneo, than from the Congo Basin and the Amazon combined. So there was more. Wow. There's been a huge amount of extraction from Sarawak. Wow. And those timber companies are also extracting timber in the Amazon and the Congo Basin. So there's a lot of Malaysian corporations that got really good at logging in Sarawak,
Mm.
and they moved to other locations around the world to do the same
Yeah.
thing.
So they made money, they were efficient at what they did, and
Mhm.
they expanded. Where are they sending the timber to?
That's a really good question. The timber goes to a lot of places. It goes to the US and to Europe. It also goes to China, Japan, South Korea. So any, you know, China and South Korea, Japan have a lot of building and construction happening. In Japan for the Olympics, they've been extracting timber specifically from Sarawak from some of the companies that um, are a little bit more notorious for um, not engaging Indigenous communities and so overrunning Indigenous land rights.
Wow. Is there a type of wood product that they're going after in particular? Like I know there's exotic woods, like some of the rose woods and things that people use as decremental or ornamental. Are there, or is it just anything that can be consumed they're cutting down?
It's mostly hardwood timber for construction. There are some really special species of trees like gaharu, which is a tree that gets naturally infused with a fungus that makes it smell really, really good. And so, you
Really?
know, 1 ounce of gaharu wood is worth, I don't know how much, but it's a very expensive, high-end product, but that's obviously not going into construction materials. That's more from one-off poaching rather than industrial logging.
Sure. Do you feel that people aren't paying as much attention to Borneo and the logging issues there versus the rainforest in the Amazon or Central Africa because of its geographical location to the west? Or is it, why don't we hear about what's happening in Borneo versus other places in the world?
I think that it's more an issue of country rather than geographic location. Indonesia gets a lot of attention in general. There's been a lot of emphasis from foundations and a little bit more emphasis in the media on Indonesian issues. And that's partly because Indonesia has a huge area of forest. But Malaysia in particular, the country of Malaysia gets less attention, partly because it's a little bit smaller,
Mhm.
partly because it's a middle income country, technically. So even though I wouldn't consider the communities where we work, the Indigenous communities, to be middle income, the country is considered middle income. And so that kind of foundations are more focused on lower income countries. Money goes towards lower income countries. Malaysia seem to be doing better, so there's less investment in those sorts of things.
Gotcha. Wow, that's pretty incredible. Yeah, when I visited Borneo in my only trip, I was blown away by the biodiversity inside the rainforest and the wealth that the country has in Malaysia in particular. I didn't go into Indonesia myself, but the the natural resources in the timber, but also in the species, the wildlife, like the bird populations and the orangutan and the proboscis monkey and the rhinoceros, and the list goes on. And I was
Mhm.
just absolutely blown away with the biodiversity that Borneo had. What what is something that people in the US or Europe, what can they do in their everyday lives to help the issues that are being thrown at Borneo? And
Well, I mean, there's things that individuals can do,
sure.
um, like pay attention to where your products are coming from. The issue is overconsumption in general all around the world. So
Mm.
knowing what you're consuming, where it's coming from, trying to reuse. I'm part of what's called a buy nothing group here in my neighborhood, and it's just people posting things that they no longer need, and also people posting requests for things that they need. There's a lot of ways to consume less overall and as a community, but I think that there's too much emphasis placed on what individuals can do in their everyday acts to it sort of puts the blame on the individual and the blame on the consumer, when really what we're talking about is more global systemic problems. And that's not on accident that the blame is placed on the individual. I mean, this is what tobacco companies were doing, and now it's what oil companies are doing, to sort of lay the blame elsewhere, when really it's these systemic problems that these large corporations are still pushing for. So it's really about engaging in that systemic change, which I do see happening all around the world. There's really incredible movements happening locally everywhere in the world. So I think a very important part of the problem is recognizing that all of these issues are connected. I'll go into, this is really about a system of predatory capitalism, and a system of economics that is preying on people, that is built from colonialism, that's built on oppression, that's built on racism. So all of these social issues are connected to all of the extraction. It's really this disregard of systems in life for profit and for money over everything else. And so engaging in this cultural shift and this cultural change that's happening all around the world is, I think, one of the most important things that individuals can do.
Yeah, and I was impressed, and we've heard this a couple of times in the past, but the previous G7 summit was one of the biggest things that they were focusing on was the climate, the environment, and bringing the United States back to the table for conversations to make a change. And I'm always optimistic, and I love to see that the world leaders are at least bringing it up and it's being talked about. And I'm hoping that trickles down to us and corporations, and we begin to see a larger shift, because I too have seen a shift recently and given me reason for hope, and we need to keep pushing that forward. What are a few of the victories that the Borneo Project has had in the last few years, things that you're very proud of as an organization?
There's been a lot going on in Sarawak as far as Indigenous victories and victories for the environment. I think one of the biggest ones is the cancellation of the Baram Dam. And so that was a dam. It was going to be the second largest dam of its kind in the world. So it was going to flood a huge area of rainforest, displace up to 20,000 people. And everyone expected it to be built. Even the experts and the activists we were talking to were basically saying that it's not worth your time to go against this dam. But in spite of that, there was a small group working really hard to organize a huge amount of people, really spreading awareness across all of the communities who would be displaced, and educating them on what that really means to be displaced. Because the government will promise one thing, you'll be moved to this settlement, you'll have access to education and jobs and all of the good things, and in reality that's not what happens. So really helping them understand what displacement meant and helping them fight for their rights had a really huge impact, and the dam was ultimately canceled.
Wow, yeah, that's a big one. What are some others that your organization's been very proud of? I mean, that one is incredible. Are there any?
Yeah, that one was a really big win. That doesn't happen that often.
Yeah.
I think there's also a lot of really small but very significant victories that we've had. What comes to mind are microhydro systems that we've built in Sarawak. So these are renewable energy systems using small water sources close to the villages that produce renewable energy just for the community. And in, I think, 2000, we completed the very first of those systems in the village of Longlawan. And that was a really interesting story. It's a Kunya community, is the indigenous group, and they were actually displaced by the Bakun Dam. But instead of moving into the resettlement camp, they moved to higher ground on their own ancestral land, and they built a renewable energy system.
Wow.
And half of the people moved to the settlement site, half of the people moved to the new site on their land. And that microhydro system is still providing electricity to this community, 20 years later, while the people in the resettlement sites are really suffering still. They don't have access to farmland. They didn't get access to any of the electricity that was produced by the Bakun Dam, which is what they were displaced for. And they're struggling. So a lot of folks are actually trying to move back to their ancestral land.
Yeah, it sounds like the people who did that made a better choice in the long term. Yeah, it's really unfortunate. What are things in the day-to-day lives that the people who you're working for, what are some of the threats that they're facing? Is it, I've been in other regions of the world, such as like Cambodia, and they're having toxins and things come down streams from the plantations or whatever. Are there other environmental factors that these people are facing besides just being relocated?
Yeah, so right now in the areas where we're working, where logging is the primary issue, logging's been going on already for a long time in these areas. That doesn't mean that these forests are depleted to the point of not being valuable. They're still extremely valuable forests, even though they've been logged over once or twice. And some of the areas are actually still have the original growth where we work. But all of these communities have been experiencing massive floods from all the logging that's been taking place over the last couple decades.
Yes, and that's the Stop the Chop campaign that I saw you guys.
Yeah, Stop the Chop campaign is our main campaign against logging. A lot of the communities are involved in that. And so they're experiencing encroachment onto their land, which is impacting their animal populations. And these communities depend on animal populations for protein. They're experiencing flooding because of the logging that's been taking place. They are experiencing siltier, muddier water in their main water source. Downstream where the oil palm plantations are, the water is also contaminated in many instances, but up in
what are they contaminated with?
Contaminated with the fertilizers and pesticides that are heavily used in the plantations.
Sure.
Mm-hmm.
So we brought up the evil palm oil or oil palm, or whatever you want to call it. It's become something that I see a lot across the internet. What is the oil palm, and tell me about it? Is it as bad as what the environmentalists say, or what's the story of the palm oil?
So oil palm refers to the actual tree, the oil palm tree, and then palm oil is the actual oil that's produced.
Okay.
And the oil palm tree is actually a pretty spectacular plant because it produces more oil per hectare than almost any other oil in the world.
Right.
So the plant itself is great. The problem is that it's been co-opted by corporations that are destroying large amounts of forests in order to plant oil palm. And oil palm can only really grow in the tropics. So that's the other issue, is that it's limited to certain latitudes around the world.
It's too good.
Yeah, if it were used, and there's very many instances of where it's used in more sustainable systems, regenerative agriculture systems, agroforestry systems, where it can be organic or there's at least fewer inputs, and where it's not a big monocrop plantation that has destroyed lots of forests in the process, it can actually be a huge boon to small holders. But that's not where the majority of the palm oil comes from that we use.
Right. Yeah. When I was driving to the Dermacut forest, I passed these large plantations for hours in a car, and I saw a lot of the repeating same names on the company boards that were at the beginning of the plantations, and I could tell that it was just a few players that were profiting off of this crop. Are there, I've heard also, and I've seen on labels, sustainably grown or organic palm. Is there an organization that's policing that, or can these organizations just slap a label on it and throw it into the marketplace?
So there's the Roundtable on Sustainable Palm Oil, the RSPO, and that as an organization is monitoring oil palm plantations for human rights abuses, for environmental policy, for deforestation. It's also received considerable criticism for, whether or not it's effective in preventing any deforestation or abuses of human rights.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of people say it's better than nothing. A lot of people say that it's evolving into something that's more strict and something that is reliable. But there aren't that many entities really policing that. I think that it is often up to the brand. So I know Nutiva, the brand Nutiva, has a lot of integrity. They actually go to where they go to where they source a lot of these products. So they have a lot of knowledge of really where it's coming from. But if you have less than that, a corporation like Nestle or, Coca-Cola, things like that, Unilever, a lot of these corporations have commitments to zero deforestation oil palm, but in reality, the oil palm companies on the ground have a lot of ways of getting around those commitments.
Gotcha. So they've kind of found the loopholes, and there's not enough people in those corporations who care enough about the actual.
Yeah, and it's hard to track. It's hard to say, oh, this jar of palm oil came from this plantation, which doesn't deforest things, even though the oil palm company itself might be operating multiple plantations, some of which are more sustainable and some of which are not.
Yeah. Who is policing the encroaching on the protected lands? I mean, because I've heard oftentimes it's like, well, this part of land is protected, and then before you know it, it's not. Like, who's making that decision? Is it the government, or is it the company just saying, stop us, we'll deal with the penalties later?
In the case of protected areas, those are monitored by the government. Okay. So we've had one case in Sarawak near the Mulu National Park, which is also a UNESCO World Heritage Site.
Yeah, I visited. That's fabulous.
Yeah, it's incredible. And there's been an oil palm company clearing land really, really close to the border. And the border is supposed to have a substantial buffer zone. This is also indigenous land at the same time. So they're technically not invading the park, but they are crossing the buffer boundary, and they are crossing into indigenous territories. And they were doing this with the consent of the government, basically. So, the government is supposed to monitor and police these practices. In reality, the oil palm companies are often the same people who are in government, so they can kind of get away with what they want.
Yeah. That was my next question. As much as I respect the government there and the people who are involved in how much is it intertwined?
Well, so this case in Mulu, one of the owners of the company, or the former owners of the company, was related to the previous chief minister of the state and the current governor of the state. There's just, people in power are often connected to logging and oil palm interests. That's just how it goes.
Yeah. Is there any solution to that, or is it just do the best with? I mean, because you don't want to get in trouble with. I don't know if Borneo has like gangs, or if there's things happening to environmentalists like there are in other parts of the world. Is there any threat to environmentalists by the powers that be?
There was a time when there were increased threats. We have a friend who had to flee to Canada for his activism, and could only return to Malaysia once he had Canadian citizenship, really, and when he was protected by the Canadian government. So there have been times where protesters are arrested and threatened. There was the death of an Indigenous activist by, hired people. A few years ago, Bill Kayong, who was an Indigenous activist protesting oil palm encroachment. But overall, it's a lot safer than countries like Brazil or Honduras, where it's become incredibly dangerous to speak out against these issues. In Sarawak, it's not quite as grim as that. There's still activism. It's not quite as dangerous. hopefully it'll stay that way.
Yeah. One of the reasons that I got involved with helping the Borneo Project with my photography work was a species that I fell in love with was the orangutan. And I feel that there's species like that around the world that can really pound at the heart of people. Like, yes, there's people who love trees, but if you show them, in my eyes, through my work with the photography, is this beautiful animal who also shares the same forest with the indigenous people, who also shares the same forest as some of these exotic trees or wherever it's coming from. So do you think that there's an advantage to showing the wildlife that is there as a way to protect it, like to bring, I guess, the general public into it? Like, do you do anything with endangered species, or is it mainly in the indigenous people?
Well, I mean, it's kind of both, but yeah, as you're saying, images of wildlife can really engage people. So that is something that a lot of organizations use is, the charismatic megafauna
Yeah.
as a way to engage people. And really, when you're protecting the charismatic megafauna, whether that's orangutan or in our area, it's the gibbon, which
Mhm.
is another ape, then you're protecting the whole ecosystem and everyone's benefiting from that.
Yeah, absolutely.
So on the one hand, it's important to acknowledge that it's really more about Indigenous resistance and Indigenous ideas and projects and Indigenous-led solutions to these issues. On the other hand, all of the creatures who are there are really important, and it's part of one system. And we actually have a survey right now called the Baram Heritage Survey. We're working in the Baram River Basin with communities who have been documenting the flora and the fauna in their territories.
Mm-hmm.
And this has been a really huge project. We've been collecting data for about 12 months now, and in spite of COVID, this project was really successful and has continued. And we're using that data to strengthen local efforts to establish a protected area, so an Indigenous managed protected area that's known as the Baram Peace Park right now. And so this project has been underway for a really long time. It originated in the Panan communities of the Upper Bottom River, who wanted to do something about deforestation and protecting their resources and livelihoods. And at the time, it was sort of a pie in the sky idea that no one ever thought would have any teeth. But in the last few years, we've been working more closely with the government, and the state government submitted a proposal to the ITTO, which is the International Tropical Timber Organization, who approved the project. This is the same way that they established the Pulong Tau National Park in Sarawak. So working with the ITTO is sort of the way that the Sarawak government understands how to implement protective measures.
Sure.
And so that project was approved by the ITTO. And now we are very close to finding the funding in order to implement it. So, this project will go forward in some way, which is another huge victory to Indigenous rights in the area. It's not all settled and set in stone yet. There's still a lot to figure out, and what happens is still, very much being decided by a lot of people. But we're working our way towards increased protection for the forests in that area.
Is this Peace Park going to be open to the public, or is this strictly for Indigenous natives and people who have been part of the community?
It'll definitely be open to others. The area already has a little bit of tourism.
Okay.
The issue is that it's still pretty remote. And so there aren't that many people who are willing to rough it in the way that you kind of need to go to these spots. I personally think it's the best way to travel. It's to these really remote communities where there's, they're extremely kind and welcoming. The food is awesome. They have, they really take care of people who come to visit them. And they have these spectacular forests around them to see. So I think the whole experience is well worth it. They're starting to build a little bit more as far as tourism infrastructure. There's one tourist lodge. They're building trails in their protected forest. So the individual communities might have their own protected forest already, whether or not it's recognized by the government. They have their own customs of protection already.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, they're willing to invite lots of people over.
Excellent. Is the tourism model something that works for Sarawak and your region? Because I know other places in the world that have large amounts of tourists who come and visit. For better or worse, they end up having larger protections because that tourist dollar is a powerful one, and it provides opportunity and revenue for the locals and governments and people. Is that something that your region encourages, or is it still something that's like, we need to figure this out?
I think that it's very much encouraged right now. I know that tourism and, quote, sustainable tourism is tricky. It comes with a lot of, more people, more trash, more impact. At the same time, there are not very many livelihood sources in these remote areas. And there also aren't very many tourists yet. So they're a very long ways away from having a big environmental impact from tourism in this particular area. But I would say that it is welcomed.
Excellent. What does an organization like you, how do you get revenue for these projects? Where can people go and donate? Are there other grants that you go after? Where does your organization receive funding?
Most of our funds come from individual donors. Over 80% of our donations come from individual donors. And so we're lucky to have a pretty solid, a small but solid base of donors. A lot of them are here in the Bay Area. But it takes a long time to grow that way, individual by individual. It means that that's pretty solid, luckily. But it also means that, we're a staff of 2 people, so we're still a very tiny organization.
Yeah.
We do get some foundation grants, but as I mentioned, foundations mostly are looking just across the border into Indonesian Borneo is the primary focus. So we don't qualify for a lot of grants.
Yeah. Where can people find the work that you're doing? Do you have Instagram, Facebook, website?
Yeah, we got all of that. It's borneoproject.org is our website, at Borneo Project on Instagram, the Borneo Project on Facebook. And yeah, we welcome all the support coming our way.
There's the puppy. That's excellent. Just a couple more questions here for you before I thank you so much for taking the time and joining me today. One of the things that I was noticing when I was leaving Borneo myself was that the view from above from an airplane reminded me eerily of flying over Iowa, central Illinois, that the land was turning into a cultivated land, like the corn crop. How do we, I know that the palm oil plantations provide some income for the locals, and how do we not stop, but at least educate the people of Indonesia and Malaysia to appreciate the resources that they currently have? And I'm not saying anything against Illinois and Iowa. Like, I live in Illinois. I love Illinois. But driving through central Illinois or Iowa is not the jungles of Borneo. How do we talk to the people who are there? And I'm not talking about the indigenous people. They absolutely appreciate the land that they have and the resources that they have. How do we influence the people who are the middle class that you're talking about, or the wealthy people, that once it's gone, it's gone? And what are ways that we can begin to educate them on what's happening in their own country, take pride in it?
Yeah, it's kind of the issue of this global narrative we have of profit above everything else. So, it's been profit is king, money is king, no matter what. And people are slowly starting to let go of this narrative. It's taking a little bit of time, but I do think that people are starting to realize that this is something that we need to address right now. You can see that with the global youth movement. And we can see that in Sarawak itself. We're getting a lot more contacts. Our local partners are getting a lot more contacts by people around Malaysia who are interested in the issues. And that is something that has just started changing in the last couple of years. So, it always comes down to community organizing and getting the word out. It's less about, you know, sort of informational directed media and things like that, and more about people learning and sharing together, less about outside organizations telling people what to do, and more about people coming together on issues that they care about and drawing in their friends and their family.
Yeah, because that's one of the things that I have a hard time with is I visited my uncle in Cambodia, and Cambodia is facing a lot of the same problems that Borneo is. And he said, I don't blame the people of Cambodia for wanting a cell phone and wanting not to be on a bicycle, to be on a motorcycle, to be in a car, to be in and have all the things that they see in Western media. And they want these things. They want an education for their family. They want nice clothes. And, some of these deforestation programs, whether it's turning the land into rubber trees or going into the jungle and chopping down a very valuable tree and selling it off to a private whomever, that he understands why that happens, and that it's complicated, and it's hard to tell the people there not to do it, but us on the outside, it's like we want to educate them to take pride in what they have and get the youth involved and to make it their cause instead of our cause. Right? Like you're saying, we don't go in and tell them, don't do this. You want them to say, hey, this is our stuff. Stop taking it and selling it off to foreign countries when they have this amazing resource themselves.
Yeah, I think it's sort of a matter of the elite players, the elite stakeholders in the game who are really profiting. Rural communities, whether they're Indigenous or not, there is some economic gain, let's say, to allowing their land to be expanded into monocrop oil palm plantations. But there's a huge loss of real livelihoods and what it means to thrive as a human. So there's too much emphasis placed on economic growth. And I think that narrative is driven by companies and corporations and government. They're the ones who are really benefiting at the expense of others. Whereas these rural communities, they may have some more income. They also have increased health issues. They also are really in more poverty because they're losing all of their resources that they used to get from the forests. In the meantime, these government players and companies are telling them that they're richer and they're getting richer. But really, it's just the companies and the corporations who are getting richer by exploiting others. So it's about players who are in power and who have the power all over the world.
Yeah, absolutely. I was blown away in Sarawak when I was walking between a couple of restaurants. I saw a beautiful brand new Bentley parked next to a horse or a mule-drawn carriage or something. I don't remember what was pulling it, but it was like, wow, that's a pretty big difference in income between those two people. And I'm sure that the person with the carriage wasn't involved in the palm oil industry, or at least if it was, it wasn't getting the fair share.
Yeah.
What would happen to Sarawak and Malaysia in general if organizations like yourself weren't there?
Wherever there are these systems of inequality that you're mentioning, this huge disparity between income levels and quality of life, just like there are in the US, income inequality has
Totally
gone through the roof. There are always people who organize against those systems of injustice. So, it's really hard to imagine such disparity without those organizations on the ground. They happen naturally because it's so obvious that those systems are not working, that those systems are unjust, and people get fed up. Some people have nothing to lose and they have to fight for what they need just to live.
Yeah.
And a lot of people are around the world are visualizing this new world that we're building, and know that it is possible and a better future is something that we're all building together right now.
Yeah, absolutely. And because of people like yourself, I really appreciate everything that the Borneo Project's doing. Jettie, I really appreciate the work that you're doing to help lead that. And I know the indigenous groups and tugging at my heart, the orangutans and the proboscis monkeys and the wildlife that I quickly fell in love with over there. I know secretly they definitely appreciate it too. And for any of us that have not been to Borneo, I highly recommend checking it out. Please check out Jettie's work on the borneoproject.org. That's your website. Follow her on Instagram, Facebook, across everything. I will have all the information on the Borneo Project in the show notes. And Jettie, I really appreciate your time. Thank you so much. And thank you for everything that you're doing for Borneo and the planet.
Yeah, my pleasure. Thanks so much for having me on today.
My pleasure. Thanks a lot. Guys, thank you so much for joining us here at The Art of Actual Change. I really hope you enjoyed this episode. I will do my best each week to try to bring you new, inspirational, motivating people who are doing work around the globe to make a big difference. If you enjoyed this episode, be sure to like down below and subscribe. And again, I really appreciate your time and thanks for joining.